Welcome back to PC Builder. I'm Jason. This is our Q&A for April 2024, and this is part 2. We're going to have even more amazing questions about RTX 5090, Ryzen 9000 series CPUs potentially coming a lot sooner than we expected, and we'll talk about the best 1440p GPU, both at the budget level and performance level, because prices have changed massively. We'll also go over things like what PCIe Gen speed you need for your future GPU. Remember, if you get value out of this video, give a like as it makes a huge difference to the channel, and of course subscribe, click that bell icon. That way you get notified when we release cool content. With that, let's jump into it. This video is sponsored by 1Password. Hackers want your stuff, but how can you remember dozens of complicated passwords? It's impossible. You need 1Password to keep you protected. All you have to remember is the one strong account password that protects everything else. Your logins, your credit cards, secure notes, or the office Wi-Fi password. And 1Password lets you securely switch between iPhone, Android, Mac, and PC with convenient features like autofill for quick sign-ins. Get 25% off individual and family plans with code JASON25. Don't be a victim. Sign up for the free trial using the link in the video description. Let's start off where else. New GPUs, new CPUs, should you buy now or should you wait? That's the question that IC1 asks. Should I wait to buy a GPU? Should I get an Radeon RX 7800 XT, an RTX 4070 12GB, maybe a used 3090 from Facebook Marketplace, or just wait for the next gen so the high-end cards drop their prices a lot? All right, let's talk about this. First, let's start off with what's happening right now. So we got a number of leaks and rumors that we are going to get announcements, both for possibly the RTX 5090. The RTX 5090 leaks are saying that NVIDIA is going to actually make that announcement at Computex, and we're going to get some kind of possible late Q3, early Q4 launch of the 5090 and the 5080. We were originally expecting those GPUs to hit in 2025. It's unclear as to why they've moved that up. However, a lot of folks are saying that it has to do with the fact that they want to accelerate their AI GPU architectures. And since they're producing them at the same time as the gaming GPUs, everything's getting accelerated basically. So they're at least going to do a paper launch of like the 5090. At the same time, they're basically launching the Blackwell AI GPU so they can accelerate the next generation because they're feeling the heat from AMD and their MI300 and 350 and the various AI chips that AMD is beginning to produce. NVIDIA is really trying to defend their market share and just go full bore if they can. So this is all being driven by AI, it seems. Again, leaks, rumors, we'll see. Computex, as I'm filming this, is about a month away, so fingers crossed here. But here's the big question. For a lot of people right now, they're like, hey, 7800 XT, the pricing just went down. The 7900 XTX pricing just got to like $850 at Newegg the other day. Should you pick something up like that, or should you wait for this mythical RTX 5090 and potentially Ryzen 9000, which again, AMD has a keynote also at Computex on June 3rd. Everyone's expecting them, at least that's the leaks and the rumors right now, to announce Ryzen 9000 series CPUs, potentially for availability as early as July. That would be the third quarter, maybe even September, but we'll have to wait and see. But should you buy something right now? I think that in general, we're not going to see price drops on the current stuff even after the new stuff drops. What often happens, let's take Ryzen CPUs. When Ryzen 7000 launched, you expected Ryzen 5000 prices would be just immediately cut. Instead, it took about 6 to 8 months for like the Ryzen 5600 to drop to a good budget CPU. And for a long time, you're just like, don't buy that CPU. It's terrible value. So it took a long time for that CPU to go down. Same with Ryzen 3000 when Ryzen 5000 launched. They held the price of the older generation artificially high to force you to kind of feel like you should buy the new stuff. That's been their history. They're not the only ones that do this. Obviously, we saw this with the GPUs as well. And we saw delays with the GPU introductions so that they could sell off the old stock. So I wouldn't necessarily bank on that we're going to see massive price cuts. Although AMD's new GPUs, they're going to launch more in the mid-range. We don't know what the pricing on that's going to be. We don't know what the discounts are going to be. I would just say that there's so much uncertainty. If you want to wait a month and see what happens in terms of CPUs and GPU announcements, go right ahead. But I wouldn't bank on like massive price to performance changes in the market just yet. And I feel like for anybody who actually wants to build now, who doesn't want to wait for that stuff, you're probably going to be absolutely fine. Absolutely fine. Remember, just because NVIDIA drops the 5090 doesn't mean you're going to get the 5070 in 2024. Probably still likely maybe 2025. Remember, no matter what you buy, no matter what you build, within a couple of weeks, I guarantee you something else will be announced, something else will come out, And your thing that was the best on the planet may not be the best anymore. And that's just the way it goes. So you just got to pick your spot and get in wherever you feel comfortable. All right, Tarnish Yadavs asks, what's the best budget 1440p GPU right now in 2024? And I got to tell you, this has probably changed quite a bit in a number of markets, because previously I would have said immediately the RX 6700 XT or 6750 XT, both of which have 12 gigs of VRAM. They get really good performance for their price, which was right around $300. While they still are hanging on in the US, I know that they've dried up in other markets right now. And AMD is pushing the RX 7600 XT 16 gigabyte GPU out there, but it has less performance than the 6700 XT. And as we got into a lengthy discussion in the comments, it also is not the greatest for PCIe Gen 3 systems out there, because they did the whole thing where they did a by 8 bandwidth. So instead of using the whole connector, they only used half it at PCIe Gen 4. So when you put on a PCIe Gen 3 system, you do lose anywhere from 7 or 8% at 1440p. Not a huge loss. It's not like the 6500 XT, total disaster of a GPU that launched where it was only using 4 lanes, 1/4 of the bandwidth. It uses 8. It's not as good as the 5500 XT either, where that was only using 8 lanes, but it wasn't so fast that it would actually saturate the entire bandwidth. So I think we're finding the limit of by 8 for PCIe Gen 3. That being said, if you're looking for something out there at 1440p, I do like the 7700 XT now at $399. It's a much better price point. In fact, I saw one for $389 the other day. I feel like that price is just going to whittle down, especially as we get closer to the end of the year. And AMD is probably going to launch a new series of more mid-range GPUs. Remember, their higher-end RX 8000 series GPUs, they canceled those because they were going to be multi-chip modules, and they just could not get them to work, reportedly. They never came out and said this. Those were the rumors, that they could not get those to work, so they canceled those in order to accelerate development on the next generation, which I guess they'll call RX 9000 series GPUs for the higher end, and to get those out sooner. So what we're going to get is a more mid-range and budget, what they call mainstream, mid-range and mainstream focused GPUs. And rumors out there that they're going to use GDDR6 instead of GDDR7 on these. Probably a cost-cutting measure on these GPUs out there, I would think at least. I would think that's a cost-cutting measure in order to sell them at better price to performance maybe than we've gotten in a while. That being said, do you want to wait till the end of the year to get a GPU? Probably not. You probably want something right now. And honestly, how much are you going to save? And, are you going to save $50 or $60? How much better is the performance really going to be? It's always tough to tell. Do you want to wait 7 or 8 months for that card? I prefer not to wait 7 or 8 months. Get something now, maybe upgrade the following generation. It's not like you're going to miss out entirely if you upgrade now and then something comes out that's faster. Something always is coming that's faster. So I would think about it like that in terms of the best 1440p GPU. But honestly, I still like the 7800 XT on the higher end. But if you're looking more in the budget range, somewhere between that 6700 XT and the 7700 XT are my choices. RNGS, would I recommend the RTX 3060 12 gigabyte games like Fortnite? Definitely for Fortnite, Helldivers 2, and Minecraft. Does well in Minecraft too. If so, what would be the best PSU for a GPU like this? Well, the good news is something like the RTX 3060, I'm still recommending that GPU. Yeah, I know it seems like what's 3 years later, right? I'm still recommending that GPU as the best kind of entry-level GPU that got more than 8 gigs of VRAM, because you can still reliably, at least in the US, pick it up for $280 to $300, and it'll work with even the older PCIe Gen 3 system. So if you want to pick it up with like a Ryzen 5500, do a great little budget gaming PC build, you can do something like that. And it'll get you at 60 average FPS across a wide range of titles at 1440p ultra settings. I typically recommend turning everything down to high to get better FPS. Ultra settings to me are for taking screenshots. High is where I like to play my games, because you don't usually get much more visual fidelity kind of in a motion game, right? In motion. I do like the RTX 3060 still for entry-level 1440p gaming. I think you can build a great little system with it. I think especially if you're sitting on a much older GPU, like a 1060, still a good upgrade around $289. That being said, if you can afford a little bit more, I do like the 7600 XT, 6700 XT, if you can still find that. Always going to be up to you. And I think for the games you're talking about, Fortnite especially, slightly favors NVIDIA GPUs. That being said, not to the extent that you'd want to get an inferior NVIDIA GPU in order to get, a GPU that's favored by Fortnite, because faster GPUs are just going to be faster despite that whatever small amount of favoring it does. Helldivers 2 is a game that I play a lot of. I play obviously on higher end GPUs at 4K. Haven't really tested it out But I will say I play at the high level settings. A couple of those settings you can turn off and actually massively improve your frame rates. I know people have done videos on improving a lot of things for Helldivers too. The other thing is they just keep releasing patch after patch, and I feel like my performance on that just kind of goes woo like this as they release all these bug fixes. So that's one thing also to keep in mind. In terms of PSU, the great thing about that is it just doesn't use a lot of power. Often get away with like a 550 watt PSU. iMount asks a great esports question. Is 1440p 240 hertz gaming worth the jump from 1080p 240 hertz gaming in price, or should you wait until the tech has gotten cheaper? I actually think the tech is cheaper right now. I would go 1440p 240 hertz. Now, typically we've pushed frame rates as a way of getting a competitive advantage. And when I make a shot, what I'm seeing is actually the true frame. Right? I'm not waiting for a frame to be rendered or anything like that. I will say though, as you turn the resolution up, even if you just go with more basic settings, things are being rendered with more pixels, so you can see better. As long as you can maintain an acceptable frame rate, that you're not losing that frame rate advantage while you're gaining a slight resolution advantage on that. Something like a 7800 XT in a lot of competitive titles, especially if you play like CS2, if you play like Fortnite, if you play those kinds of games, it's just going to give you tons and tons of frames at 1440p. I think it's a no-brainer. You also need a 1440p 240 hertz gaming monitor, and the good news is they've come down to a relatively reasonable price. They're not that much more expensive now than the 1080p 240 hertz monitors. You can pick one up for right around $300. I'll leave some of them linked down in the video description. There are good deals right now. There's almost price parity now between 1080p 240 hertz and 1440p 240 hertz. It's not that far off anymore, to the point where I would now kind of spend the extra money to jump up to 1440p 240 hertz. I just think you're going to get a slight competitive advantage doing that. 500 FPS to 240 to bump up to a better resolution. I think that's better, but you esports pros out there, let me know down in the comments if you disagree with me. We got some great questions about PCIe bandwidth for GPUs, especially PCIe Gen 5 GPUs that may be announced coming soon. So Ryozo asks, will there be a difference if you put a future PCIe Gen 5 GPU in a 4.0 slot? Should you basically get a motherboard, a modern motherboard with a PCIe Gen 5 slot and spend extra for that? Chaos Designer basically asking the same thing, but more about budget GPUs and some of the problems that they've experienced with GPUs that have only used part of the connector. So what are we even talking about here? Well, GPUs basically like this one here, this connector down here is your PCIe connector. And this plugs in and it has 16 lanes. It's 16 lanes for the connector itself on the motherboard. And they run at a certain speed. Okay, so a lot of motherboards out there were PCIe Gen 3 speed, then we got PCIe Gen 4, and now we have PCIe Gen 5 slots out there. As I'm filming this right now, there are zero PCIe Gen 5 GPUs available. Now that may change here in the next month. We may get one or more of them announced. We'll have to wait and see. But at the same time, I want to say, fret not, an RTX 4090 will run just fine on a PCIe Gen 3 GPU slot. So I kind of feel like PCIe Gen 5 at least has been a total boondoggle, and people were complaining about Ryzen motherboard prices for Ryzen 7000, and they were complaining about the new, Intel Z series motherboard prices. They have those PCIe Gen 5 GPU slots and SSD slots on them, also total waste of money, in my opinion, because consumers don't really see any benefit from them. And they drove motherboard prices up. There's licensing fees, there's the implementation of the technology. They've got to add, I think, an entire another layer of copper to them, basically. There's all the traces for them. There's just a lot of additional costs, and I would much rather pay for way better features that I as a gamer or I as a content creator actually want on the motherboard. So I wouldn't really worry about PCIe Gen 5 GPUs. Those GPUs will more than likely work just fine in a 4.0 slot. First of all, PCIe is backwards compatible. So I can plug a faster device into a slower slot and it'll just run at the slower rated speed. But those new GPUs will not saturate that slower rated speed, so there's nothing to really worry about. Again, RTX 4090 runs just fine on PCIe Gen 3. There's a separate problem, though, with some of the more budget tier GPUs that we've seen on the AMD side. This is 6500 XT is the famous example of this, but they have been for years now on the 600 series cards doing something where they're only using half of this connector here. If you looked really close, you could see traces going to all these pins down here, but then it just stops here, and this is just gonna blank on this side of it. Can't really zoom in with this camera here, so you can't really get a good angle. But that's That's the way it looks. And on something like the 6500 XT, where it was only using 4 lanes at PCIe Gen 4, yeah, if you plug that into a PCIe Gen 4 motherboard, it had plenty of bandwidth. But if you plugged it into a PCIe Gen 3 motherboard, suddenly you didn't have enough bandwidth, right? Because it was half as much bandwidth. And you're only using 4 lanes instead of 16 or even 8. Now, that hadn't really been a problem for other GPUs like the 6600, 6600 XT, did the same thing, but they weren't fast enough to saturate the bandwidth because they were using 8 lanes. This GPU, the 7600 XT, recently tested on a PCIe Gen 3 motherboard. This you lose at 1440p about 7 or 8%. This is not a huge loss on this GPU, but there is now a loss. GPUs like this are now getting fast enough where if they're only using half the connector, they can saturate PCIe Gen 3. But now we're talking Gen 4 is double the speed, Gen 5 is double the speed again. I don't think in terms of future-proofing, you need to worry about getting anything more than Gen 4, although I think you're going to end up with a Gen 5 one almost regardless these days. I do think for older budget systems, we're going to still have to look out for this on older Gen 3 systems as they keep trying to do cost-cutting measures like this. All right, Benson asks, what are my thoughts on future-proofing when buying PC parts? How do you factor upcoming technologies such as path tracing into buying decisions? Let's just throw in the new technology that's coming as well. What about the fact that new graphics cards coming? We have new CPUs more than likely coming very, very soon as well, like Ryzen 9000. Let's start with future-proofing. Don't do it. Just don't do it. We've gone through this time and time and time again, and I'll give you a million examples here of how it never works out. Never works out. What happens is because we only have a set amount of money, most people have a set amount of money that they're going to be able to commit to buying a gaming PC. Whatever you spend on future-proofing one component comes at the expense of undersizing another component. And typically that's the balance between your CPU and GPU. So if you future-proofed a couple years ago by buying a Ryzen 3700X instead of Ryzen 3600, and the cost difference I think was like $120 at most times between the two, that meant that $120 came out of something else in your overall system. Possibly came out of your GPU, possibly came out of better storage, possibly came out of a lot of things out there, better cooling. And as a result, now you're ready to drop in that shiny new graphics card. The difference between the 3600 and the 3700X is like 3 or 4%. 3 or 4%. And dropping in a 5600 for $120 right now would net you way more performance on those faster graphics. 5700 XT would net you way more performance. So don't focus on future-proofing. It never works out. And as a result, you got less storage in the past. You got a weaker GPU than you would have otherwise bought. So just don't do it. It never works out. In terms of like path tracing and things like that, I gotta tell you, like, I don't want to sit here and bash ray tracing and path tracing. It's been a sandbox technology where NVIDIA gets to play in a handful of titles like Cyberpunk. If you're like way into it in Cyberpunk, then that's great. But you got to recognize you're a very, very niche audience out there. Outside of that, if you on the vast majority of titles that support ray tracing, turning it on, I struggle to see the difference, except in the FPS. The FPS goes, whew. Why wouldn't you just go from 1440p to 4K? And you say, Jason, maybe I don't have a 4K monitor, but this is the kind of thing I'm talking about here. I would look at going up in resolution first. I would only consider these technologies at 4K. Once I had comfortable frame rates at 4K, then consider them, because going up in resolution from 1080p to 1440p will change your world. Going up in resolution from 1440p to 4K, if you have a strong enough GPU, which right now they're kind of expensive, I'll admit, that will also kind of change your world. So to me, the ray tracing here on a handful of titles just isn't worth it, as opposed to going up in resolution. That's what I would recommend. I love this next question by Tulls. Are CPUs getting too complicated or complex? They feel like the architecture is reaching its limits in terms of instructions per clock, that extremely high wattage and clock speeds that can hardly be kept cool across the board are very telling. And you're focused on Intel. They're relying mostly on ridiculously high power consumption and clocks to stay ahead. But it's coming out quite recently that people are having issues with those 13th gen. In fact, if you watched our best CPU for gaming update that we just launched, I'll leave it linked down this. We went into the detail on this and what the problems were. So I'm not going to do that here. But you're basically asking, have we reached a point where in order to get more performance, we're having to have these increasingly crazy trade-offs in terms of power use, temperatures, etc.? I don't think so. I think Intel got stuck. They couldn't get their next architectures out. They've been having this problem for a while. Remember, they got stuck on 14 nanometer for like ever. It was 14 nanometer plus, 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 plus. They got stuck on that. We saw something similar in terms of the amount of power that they were dumping in, like in the 11900K, right? Then 12th gen was a real breath of fresh air. They went to the big little architecture. And I was like, yes, Intel is back here, because we don't ever want one player. I know right now it's been recommending a lot of Ryzen stuff. And again, that has to do with the power usage and the cost of the Intel CPUs. We don't ever want any one of these players, any one of these companies to be so dominant in the market that they get to dictate things, because we've seen them all at various points do this, and it is not pretty. It's not pretty when AMD has the lead as they do right now with CPUs. I'm kind of hesitant to see what those prices look like, but hey, I'm also open to being pleasantly surprised. I think there's a lot of room left in terms of pushing performance. Most of the CPUs, we can go to 4 nanometer to 3 nanometer, and then there's processes beyond that. I remember 10 or 15 years ago, I have a friend of mine who works for Qualcomm, and he was talking about, back in the early 2000s, I don't know how much more smaller these processes can get. We've already got them so small. We might be coming to the end of the x86 architecture. Here we are 20 years later, and we're still pushing things. So I think that we continue to meet these engineering challenges, which is great. There are theoretical limits, of course. There's kind of next gen computing stuff that is not ready for prime time. We are stuck with the architecture we have. There's ARM, there's other things out there. I think there's a lot more to go. And I don't necessarily think it just has to go down the high power route. I think Intel got stuck. But if you look at the 7800X 3D and the power that thing uses, it's night and day. And I think Intel needs to say, oh, maybe we should have 3D V-cache on our CPUs too. So I think that Intel could hopefully get unstuck. And I do want to see them be competitive with AMD. I don't want to just be recommending AMD products out here. I'm hopeful for the future, but I do think there's a lot more to push these CPUs. Remember, if you got value out of this video, give it a like, so it makes a huge difference to the channel. And of course, subscribe. Click that bell icon. That way you get notified when we release cool content. Hey, speaking of cool content, did you check out the previous Q&A episode? It's right here. We go through even more cool questions, stuff that you really want to know. Check it out, and we'll catch you on the next one.